Well, good evening and welcome again to our August gathering of Acting for Justice While Sheltering in Place. And tonight we continue the conversation about racism. We thank you all for joining us on what we think is a very important project. This does seem to be a critical moment in our history when a shift in consciousness and the prospect of a more just world seem within our grasp. And there are conversations being had that have not been had by white people, at least not in the United States. There are voices in business and government and entertainment, sports and academia that are speaking out in ways that suggest a movement. And tonight we would like to give added momentum to that movement, so we're very glad you're here. A program note, if you didn't already notice this, tonight's scheduled speaker, Dr. Kevin Cosby, had a last-minute conflict, and so Dr. Louis Brogdon has agreed to join us for tonight's event at the last moment. We're so grateful to him to be able to step in at the last moment, and I will introduce him shortly. So let us begin with prayer. God of justice, in your wisdom, you create all people in your image without exception. Through your goodness, open our eyes to see the dignity, beauty, and worth of every human being. Open our minds to understand that all your children are brothers and sisters, kin to us in the same human family. Open our hearts to repent, if we must, of racist attitudes, behaviors, and speech which demean others. Open our ears, if they're closed, to hear the cries of those wounded by racial discrimination and their passionate appeals for change. Strengthen our resolve to make amends for past injustices and to right the wrongs of history. And fill us with courage that we might seek to heal wounds, build bridges, forgive and be forgiven, and establish peace and equality for all in our communities. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker again. Dr. Louis Brogdon is a visiting professor of preaching and Black church studies at the Baptist Seminary of Kentucky, a position shared with Simmons College of Kentucky, a historically Black college located here in Louisville, where most of you know the JustFaith Ministries office is also located. He has served in numerous positions in undergraduate and graduate institutions as both professor and administrator. In addition, he is the author of several books. I'll name just a couple of them: The Spirituality of Black Preaching, Hope on the Brink, and No Longer a Slave but a Brother. We at JustFaith Ministries are proud to claim him as a consultant on our racial justice programs. He's an ordained minister of 26 years and has pastored churches in Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Ohio. And my friends, he's done all of this before his 100th birthday. So Dr. Brogdon, we are delighted to have you with us again, and welcome.
I'm glad to be with you all. Good evening, everyone. Truly excited and honored to be able to step in the very, very large shoes of our president, Dr. Kevin Cosby. But I love the folks at JustFaith Ministries, and so when I got the call from Dr. Cosby, you know, I knew I was going to step in because, you know, I believe in this work that we're doing and the moment in which we find ourselves. So I'm back doing what I love, which is talking about issues of racial justice. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And as you all heard just a few minutes ago, since we're you're going to do 2 sessions, and can you all see the presentation? Excellent. All right. So since we're only doing 1 session this month, that means I get double time. We get to go to about 10 o'clock. and then I'll let you all go. I'm only kidding. I'm going to go for about 45 minutes, and so that we can have some time for Q&A. So we will hit the ground running. Just make sure. So tonight's topic, I wanted to tweak it a little bit, and instead of talk about what we continue to get wrong about race, I really wanted to shift the focus to talk about what we continue to get wrong about racism. Because what I want to do in my focus is focus on what race produces, which is, of course, racism. We find ourselves, I think, in an incredible moment. I think this moment, as difficult as it is really a gift. It is a gift that people are doing something a little different than I think has been the norm. So I want to share a resource with you. It's called Virginia Capital Connections Quarterly Magazine. I want you to go online next week and look for it. And I have a brand spanking new article that's coming out. And the title of the argument is Why We Keep Talking Past Each Other about the issue of racism. So that's Virginia Capital Connections Quarterly. And one of the things I mentioned was that, you know, our educational system does us no favors when you really think about our history and all the things that have transpired. I mean, we're talking about slavery, genocide of Native Americans. Then it gets followed up with things like the Black Codes, convict leasing. None of these things are a part of a normal education in the United States of America. So what we end up doing is producing masses of citizens who don't understand all the things that have happened. So that's one of the reasons why, as a country, we're just so accustomed to talking past each other and getting into shouting matches. So it's a couple of the things that I talk about in this piece that I really hope you'll go online next week and just kind of spend some time and sit with this particular piece, because I believe it'll be incredibly helpful for you. Because what ends up happening is, because we have masses of people who don't really understand these issues, then when it's time to address them, to correct them, to repair them, then that is a heavy lift, because, you know, people really don't understand what has happened. They think everything is fine. And so this summer has really kind of just pulled the covers off of that and really exposed that there are some real problems. There are some deep inequities in this country. The people have been trying to speak and talk about these things, and they have not been listened to. And so now it has exploded into our streets. Look what the quote says. It says, "We cannot fix the problems racism created because we will not face our racism as a country." What I mean by facing is learning what it is, how it worked historically, how it works today, who benefits from it, and who's negatively affected by it. That's what I'm talking about. So I think this is kind of a gift, because now people are willing to listen, and not only listen, but to admit that there's some things they need to learn. So I think that's a real gift that we should steward, which again is why on short notice, you know, I really had to step in, you know, and to be able to share on tonight, because anytime you have masses of people who want to have these kind of conversations, I believe that's just something incredibly special. And that's what the article will look like. And I wanted to and I mentioned a couple of quotes, and the one that I just read was right there. That what I mean by facing it is learning what it is, how it worked historically. So what I'm going to talk about tonight are 5 things we get wrong about race and racism. All right, just 5 things. A couple I'm going to kind of move through quickly, and then a couple I'm going to, you know, I'm going to slow the car down. I'm going to actually pull into the driveway really, really slowly. I'm going to walk up to your door and knock on your door. I mean, we're really going to spend some time on a couple of them. So 5 things we get wrong about race and racism. the first thing we get wrong is this belief that racism is going away. It's the and I'm all for optimism, but when you're talking about dealing with systemic issues, you have to do that with some realism. And one of the manifestations or expressions of this belief, well, it's just going away, is that, like, sometimes this is what we do in, even in colleges and universities. We teach people, race is a social construct, and once people understand that this idea of race is something that we created to justify colonialism and slavery, then we just think somehow racism, it goes away once people kind of understand, oh, it's just a social construct. It doesn't have any basis in biology. Underneath our skin, we're all humans. And so, well, just because it's a social construct doesn't mean racism is not a part of the fabric of our world and our lives. A lot of people kind of got carried away with Barack Obama becoming the president and thought that, somehow we were in this post-racial moment. I remember a white colleague actually telling me that he didn't know what the problem was, with black people, because everything was fine because, we had a black president. And, so I started laughing, and my friends knew when I was laughing like that, it was like, Lewis is getting upset. But I was just laughing to kind of calm myself down because I wanted to ask him, how many black friends do you have? Because just because Obama was in the White House does not mean racism went away. In fact, it got worse. So I want to introduce you to a source, Derek Bell's work, Faces at the Bottom of the Well. Just dispels this myth that, racism is going away. It's not. Now, do I wish do I want it to be this way? Well, absolutely not. But for 400 years in this country, racism has been around. And I seriously doubt if it's going anywhere. And just by saying racism is permanent in this country, it doesn't mean that we're not trying to face it and to overcome it. But you can't confront something you're trying to pretend that is not there, that it's not there for a reason. So one of the things I liked about Bell's quote was he talked about how democracy and racism are historically and inherently reinforcing. So they kind of work hand in hand to keep the system the way it is. He says the permanence of this symbiosis ensures that civil rights gains will be temporary and setbacks inevitable. So if you study the history of this country, let's take Brown versus Board of Education. Yes, that's wonderful. Then you get white backlash to that. We hop up to 64, Civil Rights Act of 64. Yes, then you get the summer of 64 where all hell breaks loose. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated in 68. Okay, yes, then we get the Civil Rights Act of 68. That's great, but then you get protests and riots. So every time there's progress, there's pushback. So when Obama became the president, man, that was wonderful. But then we got the Tea Party. Then we got the Make America Great Again movement. The Ku Klux Klan, having parades, marching up and down the streets, all of this stuff. So this is what Bell is talking about. And Bell makes this statement. He says, black people will never gain full equality in this country. He says, there will be great efforts to try to change things, but the only thing they're going to do is just produce what he calls temporary peaks and programs that will be short-lived. But he says this is not a sign of submission. It's not that we're just saying, well, we can't overcome it, so we might as well not resist it. No, he actually says it's the ultimate act of defiance. So pushing back on this optimism that, it's just gonna go away, I think it robs us of the grit that we need to really fight a complex and a stubborn system of advantage. So you really want to pay attention to that book. So I think that's one thing we get wrong about racism. And I can remember sitting in a graduate seminar I'm the only African American in there. You know, we're all pursuing our PhDs, and the professor was African American, but all the students were white, and they were, Christians, and believing that, pretty soon racism is going to go away. And they asked me, they was like, Louis, do you think, racism is ever going to go away in this country? And I said, no. And they were shocked. They were shocked. Okay. But it's because, yes, I know the history, and I also know how systems work. That does not mean we're not trying to upend and challenge the system. The second thing I think we get wrong is this belief that racism is simple. There's just so much of this, well, in my opinion, I think when it comes to issues of racism, and I talk about it in my article that I hope you will go to Virginia Capital Connections next week and get the article. Because one of the things I said is that while racism is not studied in public schools and colleges, it is spoken of often in public spaces and in our political discourse. I mean, you talk about a recipe for disaster. Here, you don't educate people about what racism is, what it has done, who it has benefited, but then everybody's out in the public square talking about something they don't really understand. This is why we're in this kind of crisis moment. Because a lot of these conversations focus on individual experiences, particularly people who, like white people who say, well, I don't see racism. I don't experience racism. Yeah, I know. So yeah, that's for a reason. So you have to go beyond just what you experience. This is why in education, we try to move students out of what we call ethnocentrism, of thinking that your experience is the center of everything. And not only is it based on their experiences, but really uninformed opinions. Instead of really understanding history and the domains of knowledge that give racism context and meaning. And this is why we end up in shouting matches with people calling each other, well, you're a race baiter, you're a racist, with feelings of resentment, confusion. We get nowhere. We just talk past each other when we try to pretend racism is something that's really simple, when in all actuality, racism is incredibly complex, okay? If you want to be able to wrap your mind around racism, you're going to have to understand some history, particularly the history of colonialism and slavery. So you're going to have to really have about 500 years of history under your belt to be able to have some kind of informed conversations about the impact of racism. You're going to also need to understand some psychology and how bias and prejudice work. Then you're going to have to also understand socialization. What happens when people get in groups, institutions are formed, resources are divvied up, and you have to negotiate power. That's a lot of complexity when you get people together in groups, especially when they decide to organize themselves in groups based on race. And then there's the spiritual component. When people of faith talk about things like sin and idolatry, which is ascribing ultimate to anything besides God. So again, racism is incredibly complex, which is why I like to say in that article that racism is not for dummies. Okay, if you want to have conversations about racism, you need to do your homework, because your opinions and your experiences, they are important, and no one's trying to discount that. But again, let's move beyond ethnocentrism and thinking that what you experience is the center of everything, instead of wanting to step back and to understand that other people have different experiences and a different history that adds to your understanding of your experience and your history. So it shouldn't sort of monopolize your understanding of racism, because that's when it leads to a breakdown, when you refuse to even acknowledge that someone else's experience may be legitimate and authentic. But that's the problem. How do you convince a large group of people who have been miseducated about people of color that they have something to learn? All right. I mean, it's a heavy lift. And again, it's why I'm always so honored to be able to work with the folks at Just Faith Ministries, because I mean, they're having these kind of important and hard conversations in white space. And that is so very, very important, because the only people talking about racism can't be the people always negatively affected by it. Let's talk about a third thing we get wrong about racism, is that we try to say that racism is a thing of the past. A lot of people say, well, my family didn't own slaves. Well, slavery ended in 1865. What are you talking about? That stuff happened in the past. Sometimes even the term historic racism tries to get people to think that racism was a back then. It was a slavery thing. And sometimes we might even say, well, there were some problems during the Jim Crow era, but we don't want to really dig too deep into that, because that starts moving a little too close to our time. And my retort, my response to any sort of claim that this is all in the past is to first say that you don't understand slavery, okay? Because to say that, number one, you don't have a real idea of how long slavery was practiced in this country. Do the math, 1619 to 1865. We're talking about 246-year period. All right, that's over half of the history of this country. Slavery was legal. Then you kind of have to understand, what is slavery? This quote by Ira Berlin, incredibly important, that Berlin tries to help folks to understand that what he calls the moral stench of slavery was not just trying to denigrate Black people, but it was really to commandeer the labor of the many to make a few rich and powerful. Okay, that's what slavery was about. Slavery is about the money. Okay, it's about the money. Slavery is about the money. Slavery is about the money. Okay, it's about a group of people using cheap and almost free labor for 246 years and building the infrastructure of a country, building the foundation of one of the most powerful empires in human history, using slavery, and then of course also the genocide of our sisters and brothers in the Native American community. But it was about creating this system. And watch this now. This is why, number one, you don't even understand slavery, because I mean, slavery, this was a long time. You can trace back so many institutions, so many of our major corporations and businesses back during this 246-year period. All right, they're like our Ivy League schools and all the millions and billions of dollars in their endowments. Some of that is a product of the transatlantic slave trade and gifts they were getting from people who owned slaves. All right, but these Ivy League schools, I mean, they've got more money than they'll ever need. All right, is that just? It then slavery gets followed by another 100 plus years of legal disenfranchisement. In other words, it was still legal to do things against masses of Black people. I mean, it was legal. It was not illegal. It was legal. Whether it was the Black codes, convict leasing, Jim Crow segregation, redlining, mass incarceration. So now we're already well over 300 years. So we're not talking about the past. Redlining and mass incarceration, we're living in that era. So start thinking about racism. I call the dual aspects of racism: it's dehumanization and economic exploitation. All right, that's Dr. Brogdon's definition of racism. It's dehumanization and economic exploitation. Yes, it's these beliefs that try to dehumanize Black people. Like, for example, Black people aren't as intelligent as people in other racial groups. That's an old racist belief that tries to dehumanize African Americans. Black people are so emotional. Now that's rooted in this racist belief that Black people cannot control themselves. Old racist beliefs that go back to the 1500s. All right. So yes, racism tries to dehumanize. There's the N-word, calling Black people apes, coons, possums, baboons, all this kind of stuff. But racism is not just trying to dehumanize. It's also the economic exploitation. And then the print is a little small, but on the bottom it says racism creates systems of advantage and disadvantage, both, okay? Advantage and disadvantage. Which is why Wellman's book, Portraits of White Racism, is just such an important book. I dare you, double dog dare some of, like 20 of y'all to read this book, okay? It's a lot to chew on. He says racial consciousness is most fruitfully analyzed to use the language of the organization of advantage rather than the structure of the personality. In other words, Wellman says, get out of thinking what sustains racism is people who are individually prejudiced against blacks. That's not what it is. It's a structural relationship based on the subordination of one racial group by another. All right, so when you think of racism, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about one group exercising, a superior relationship to another group, marginalizing them, disenfranchising them, making this group, putting them in a subordinate status. Because what ends up happening in a society like this, I'll tell you what racism does, it creates gaps and inequities. I mean, look at this wonderful graphic. I mean, this is pretty good stuff. All right. What racism does is it creates this system where you have people who have been advantaged, they've benefited, okay, their families, their institutions, they get, the benefit of free labor. Then you get a group of people who are not quite on their level. So it's important to kind of see this dichotomy. So not only is there the gap, but there's also inequities. So when you start studying how resources are allocated, you will find African Americans don't have what white Americans have. And it's not by accident, and it's not because, I mean, you want to talk about an irony. People who work for free for 246 years are lazy. Like that is, that's a lot of irony. And then the people who benefited from other people working for them for free, get to tell the people they marginalize that they're lazy, and that the reason their institutions and their families and their communities don't have is because they're not working as hard as they work, okay? That's not how this history played out. This is why Nancy DiTomaso's book, The American Non-Dilemma, Racial Inequality Without Racism, is such an important book. I commend it to you, okay? I've given a dirty dog dare to like 20 people to read Wellman. Let's get another 20 to read DiTomaso's book, because she says one of the most important privileges of being white in the United States is not having to be racist in order to enjoy racial advantage. Now, let's go back to this fantastic graphic here. See, this is why you have to do justice work, because if you continue to push for equality when the system's like this, what changes? See, nothing. Justice means putting everyone on the same level. Then we move forward, but you can't move forward until everyone's on the same level. And in this country, all we want to keep talking about, everybody's equal, when the system's not equal. So first thing we got to do is we got to fix the system. That's doing justice work. So we have to be people that we must place more of a value on justice than equality. Because what she says is that here's how you understand how racism works after slavery, after Jim Crow. She argues that it is acts of favoritism that whites show each other through what she calls opportunity hoarding and the exchange of social capital that contribute most to continued racial inequality, okay? In other words, you don't have to be a racist to enjoy racial advantage, okay? Because the system is arranged in such a way where you're in good shape. So all you do is start hooking up all your friends, giving your friends favors, giving your friends opportunities. And not only that, then you turn around and you then pass down trillions of dollars in wealth. Wait a minute. I thought we were supposed to, pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps. What do you mean you're getting something that another generation is passing on to you? This is a benefit white people get. That other minorities are like, man, I wish I had somebody who would pass down something so that I can put a huge down payment on a house instead of having to do that all on your own. So Thomas Shapiro's book is excellent. He says, well, baby boomers, they're getting ready to, and this process has been going on for about almost 30 years. We have 10 more years of it. $9 trillion in wealth is being passed down baby boomers to Gen X, millennials, etc. In other words, this is white wealth that's being passed down. And what wealth does is it cancels out gains when you start thinking about what people are earning, what they're doing in classrooms, because what it does is it gives that generation, it gives them a head start. It gives them an advantage that other people don't have. So Shapiro shows that whites have about $136,000 advantage and blacks have $136,000 disadvantage, okay? So again, we're just so far behind because that's what racism is. It's a system engineered to do this. And how is it possible? Because of policies that are straight up racist. Let's take the Homestead Act, for example. It gave handouts to white people, all right? 160 acres of land that the government just gave out to white people, all right? Now, and then my white brothers and sisters are gonna be swearing up and down, oh, affirmative action is wrong. You're not supposed to, government handouts is wrong. Well, they got it. All right, they got so much land. It's basically the state of California and Texas combined. You want to talk about two huge states, 1.5 million families, 246 million acres. All right, blacks left slavery and all they wanted was 15 acres and a mule, and they got nothing. All right, before the Civil War even ended, the government's giving out land to whites scot-free. Now, one study puts the number of homestead descendants, that's you folks, at 46 million. All right, so your parents were homeowners because of this, and we were shut out from that. So we didn't get the head start. All we get are deficits versus what whites get, they get advantages so they can continue to build wealth in ways that African Americans, they've never had those opportunities. All right, so I parked on that one. I'm gonna park on this one, and then I'm gonna rush to the close. The fourth thing I think we get wrong about racism is this belief that you can be neutral. And this is a very interesting part. All right, so I wanna take my time with this. Now, a lot of people wanna say this, I am not racist. Okay, I'm not racist, I'm not a racist. All right, now Dr. Ibram Kendi, and I remember him right when he graduated from Temple University, and he came down to Claflin University. It was HBCU in South Carolina that I was teaching at, and he was talking about his dissertation. I had no idea. This dude is like a rock star now, but he's published two books. One's called Stamped from the Beginning, and the other is called How to Be an Anti-Racist. A great, great book. He's really challenging the discourse of critical race theory. He's actually trying to change the way we have some of these conversations. So I think Kendi's work it's very, very interesting, and I do commend it to you. There's some things I'm really chewing on. But one of the things I like was he tried to really interrogate how this word functions in society. Okay, because people, man, if you want to get somebody riled up, hit them with you're a racist. And what's going to be the response? Oh, no, I am not a racist. I have a black friend, or, I read a book by a black person. I like Michael Jordan. I like LeBron James. I watch football, whatever they're going to say. Because what he says is that racist isn't a descriptive word in our society. It's a pejorative word. So when somebody calls you a racist, he says it's the equivalent of the equivalent of saying, I don't like you. All right. And so what Kendi says is he wants to kind of turn that. Now, this is a lengthy quote, but I want to read it because it's pretty important. He says, what's the problem with being not racist? Question mark. It is a claim that signifies neutrality. I'm not a racist, but neither am I aggressively against racism. But there is no neutrality in the racism struggle. The opposite of racist isn't not racist. It is anti-racist. What's the difference? One endorses out of the idea of a racial hierarchy as a racist or racial equality as an anti-racist. One either believes the problems are rooted in groups of people as a racist or locates the roots of problem in power and policies as an anti-racist. One either allows racial inequities to persevere as a racist or confronts racial inequities as an anti-racist. There is no in-between safe space of not racist. The claim of not racist neutrality is a mask for racism. Whoa, that's interesting. All right, so what Kendi is doing is he's completely challenging our whole discourse around race. Because when we say, well, I'm not a racist, what are you really saying? Kendi is saying you can't say that. No one can say that. You're either a racist or you're anti-racist, okay? You're either promoting racist beliefs or you are attacking and you are working to dismantle those beliefs. You can't just be in the middle and to say that you're neutral, okay? You're either holding up racist policies, or you're either trying to dismantle those things. You can't be neutral. And so to me, that's the brilliance of Kendi's work, because one of the things Kendi said in the book also is that he says the consistent function of racist ideas of any kind is to manipulate us into seeing people as the problem instead of the policies that ensnare them. So what he's saying is we need to kind of get out of this attack mode on persons and really start focusing on the policies that uphold these systems. Now I'm going to turn the corner a little bit. The fifth thing I think that we get wrong is that racism is not a pastoral and pastoral care issue. This is where I'm showing my pastoral sensibilities that I bring to my scholarship. Some people, when they have conversations about racism, they think racism is a social issue. Okay, yes, it is. But it's also a spiritual issue. There is a spiritual component. The church has been entrenched and involved in this. There are racist beliefs connected to the teachings in the Bible and how the church has interpreted those passages in Scripture. There are churches who have benefited from the enslavement and disenfranchisement of African Americans. So you can't say there's not a spiritual dimension. It's there, and we try to attend to both the social as well as some of these spiritual and religious dimensions. But I told you about an article that's coming out in Virginia Capital Connections next week. I also have a second article that's coming out in Christian Ethics Today, because what I want to do is to also argue that there's something that studies in social justice and advocacy are not really attending to, and that is the pastoral dimensions of nurturing people during times of challenge and change. I don't hear a lot of people talking about this. I know we're protesting, we're challenging systems, we're calling for change, and there is an incredible amount of pain in our country right now that we must also give some attention to. You can't just focus on the social dimensions and not understand that people need, in a pastoral way, to be nurtured into change and to understand challenge, the import, the religious and the theological foundations for why we need to build this kind of world instead of just a heavy-handed, this is what we got to do, whether you like it or not. So I want you, it'll come out next week. Go to Christian Ethics Today online and look up my article. The name of the article is We Can't Stay Here Anymore. And it's talking about that we're in this new era of racial separation and racial estrangement. I argue in this piece that today, under the clamor of our public discourse, there is a silent trail of pain long ignored by churches, its theologians, pastoral caregivers, and people of goodwill. Amidst the retrenchment of racial animus and violence, the reemergence of overt racism, and the appalling silence of people we thought were partners and friends, there has been a steady retreat to racialized spaces. Racism has reemerged and intensified across this nation. And individuals and families have faced the cold, hard, and bitter realization that they cannot stay here any longer. I use the motif of moving to kind of explain this new era that we are in, where there's been all of these interracial coalitions, interracial friendships, interracial churches, and there's been an incredible amount of loss for the past 5 or 6 years. I mean, there have been friendships that have been broken. People can't talk to certain family members, certain friends. It is a very, very painful time that I really spent some time saying we need to give some careful attention to this because a lot of people are dealing with grief. There are probably people who you're watching me right now. You've lost friends. You've maybe had to stop going to a church. Someone in your family. I mean, it's real. When you thought we grew up with certain kind of beliefs and values, and then you start hearing people saying things that are fundamentally wrong or you disagree with, and so there's an incredible amount of loss, and I think we get that wrong. We minimize that. I think that pain is a part of some of the anger. Okay, and when you're dealing with grief, there is a stage where there is a lot of anger, and that's fine. I'm just not sure people are even aware of that complication, those feelings of anger, because they've lost some things. They lost. They can't even go back to their church. Some people can't go back to their families anymore. So I think it's a very, very important issue. It is a lengthy, meaty article that I hope you will read. And I write all this stuff for free, because I just love it, being able to share. So let me move to a close. I think when Kendi argues we can't be neutral, then what we're looking for with folks with like JustFaith Ministries and all you who've joined us tonight, we need partners in anti-racist work. We don't need people who want to just feel good and just be able to say, I'm not a racist. Okay, I like black people. What are you doing about dismantling the system that disenfranchises us? That's what we need. We need people who want to say, hey, let's go to work to dismantle these beliefs and these systems. We need people who are anti-racist, all right? Because nobody on here tonight wants to be a racist. I just want to move you from saying I'm not a racist to being anti-racist, okay? An anti-racist is working to dismantle racist beliefs and policies, all right? So now this is going to be a resource this coming down the pike from me, and the resource is called Planning After Protesting. Okay, it is okay. It's about a 59-page PDF magazine that really explains what's next after this moment. And one of the things I talked about in this little booklet is there are 3 stages for moving to a protest moment to a movement. So what I'm hoping is that this doesn't become a movement, and I'm already really concerned. Momentum is starting to decline. Interest is starting to lessen. I mean, and it's understandable. There is a pandemic kind of going on as well, and its effect on the economy. We're going to be dealing with that for quite some time. So there is real concern that we're not going to do everything we can in this moment that we need to do. So that's why, I mean, I really jumped on this, and I'll be working hard to get this out to you as soon as I possibly can. But there are 3 particular stages. You kind of have this protest stage. Then you have this educational, this advocacy stage where people are trying to understand, the nature of the problem. How do we get here? But then the focus is when we get to the 3rd stage, and this is my real concern, is we need plans, okay? We need a plan of action that needs to be outcomes based, all right? So I'm a dean of assessment as well. And so outcomes means, where do you want to be in 5 years, 10 years, 25 years? Where do we want to see the Black community in this country in 25 years? We need to set outcomes. And if that's where we want to be, then we have to start thinking, okay, then what do we need to do to get there, instead of too much energy and emotion and not thinking about the kind of planning that's going to take this step, that step, that step, that step. All right. So it's moving away from the Moses model of leadership that speaks truth to power. This is what God says, let my people go. Or, telling, hey, this is wrong. We got a lot of Moseses. We need Nehemiahs. Okay. Nehemiahs are people who, they build walls. They're into infrastructure. Okay. They're into the stuff that protects the community. And this is going to be, I think, a very, very important part that turns this moment into a movement. And it's not going to become a movement if we do not get the support of our white sisters and brothers who are doing what we call anti-racist work. In other words, you are down to dismantle these systems, and it's going to cost you something, because you are here, you're benefiting, okay? But you're gonna have to come out of that radical Gospel of Luke, Jesus tradition that says a disciple will give up everything to follow Jesus. So there should be willingness to say, hey, whatever I gotta do, whatever I gotta give up, I'm willing to do it. We gotta dismantle these systems so that there is justice in this land. And we don't get there without policies, without programs that are going to correct and support the Black community. And so what I want to argue is that the next phase of the civil rights movement is rebuilding the infrastructure of the Black community. Okay, so infrastructure that it was meager, but it was in place during the Jim Crow era. Think about, for example, we had Negro basketball leagues, Negro baseball, Black banks, Black insurance agencies. Okay, because of the Plessy v. Ferguson, separate but equal. So Blacks had to kind of have their own thing. Well, King inspires us to move towards an integrated society, and in good faith, taking our Christian faith seriously, we relinquished our institutions. And then only a few of us were allowed into white space, and our community was completely just decimated and left vulnerable, which is why we have 2.6% of the wealth, even though we're 13% of the population. We have the same wealth levels in 2020 that we had when we left slavery in 1865. I mean, that is ridiculous. So the next phase of the civil rights movement, yeah, we still need our Moseses, but we need some Nehemiahs. We need some nerds like Dr. Brogdon and people who are into plans, who are gonna say, what do we need to do in the next 5 years? Okay, we need to focus on things. We need to focus on, Black press, strengthening our churches, strengthening our families, strengthening Black-owned businesses, strengthening our schools, particularly our HBCUs. Every HBCU should be endowed. The federal government should put a lot more money into HBCUs. They educate most of the Black middle class. And then also strengthening entertainment. And when I say entertainment, yeah, we know that entertainment is so important, but again, we don't control it. Okay, so Black people are always making money for more powerful and wealthy white people. And we have to start changing those dynamics. And some of those conversations are going on, but like, some of these NBA players, they're like, yeah, we need change. And some want to suggest some radical things like form our own league. But then these other players who are like, man, I'm getting these big checks, from these owners. I can't do that. All right. So this is going to be, I think, unfolding over the next few years as we think about how do we reconstitute ourselves as a community. And it doesn't mean we're going to be closed off from white people. You all have your institutions. Okay, so it's nothing wrong. Every culture, all people, they all have their own institutions. I mean, one study told us that the dollar stays in the Asian community over 20 days before it leaves. It stays in the white community 15 days before it leaves. The Hispanic community, their dollar, circulates within their community, about 8 days. The Black community, because we have no infrastructure, we don't own stuff, our dollar stays in our community like a few hours before we have to go, our dollar goes outside of our community. So even though we have the buying power of the 89th largest country in the world, when you don't own anything, all you're doing is making everyone else rich. So we're not the owners, we're always the lenders. We're stuck in this in this sort of paternalistic frame of mind. So this is a pretty good resource you should avail yourself to. It's like $1,000, but who's counting? I'm just kidding. And I think the thing that's going to help us to get there is a focused Black agenda. So all I'm going to be doing is just putting this out as a model to Black leaders. Man, we can tweak it. They can throw it away and say we should do this. It's fine. But I think we need to have the conversation. I think the Black agenda can't be 100 things. We need to focus on what are the most pressing issues and the most pressing areas in need of attention. And to me, it's the criminal justice system. We need criminal justice reform. We need you getting behind that because there are lots of problems with policing. Okay. Every time a police officer pulls behind me, I am terrified. Minister, scholar, all these things. I'm literally terrified. I do not want to ever be pulled over by a police officer. And I don't want my sons to be pulled over by a police officer because there are problems with policing in this country. There are problems when a person who has brown skin is being sentenced because the sentencing project will tell you the darker your skin, the harsher your sentence. All kind of problematic laws and policies, as well as assessing the residual effect of mass incarceration. Okay, marijuana, as it is becoming legalized, all of the millions and millions of dollars that's going to flow into these businesses, they need to give some of that money back because of the way arrests around just simple possession of weed would get African Americans arrested and imprisoned. And now whites are getting rich off of the weed that completely decimated the Black community for well over 3 decades. Okay, so we need to start thinking about reforming the criminal justice system, dealing with some of these deep economic disparities we have in this country. And I'm pushing for what I call a multi-generational reparations program. I just don't believe you can ask a single generation to make up for 400 years. I think we need a multi-generational reparations program that could begin with endowing HBCUs and maybe doing something around student loan debt and maybe something else that then another generation behind us can continue to build on. And that money can come out of all the waste we have on defense spending, and it could be a win-win for the country. And then significant reforms in education, which again, dealing with some of these inequities in how educational institutions are funded, dealing with the way we have organized our public school system, that the funding revolves around taxes coming out of particular zip codes. We've got to address that, because all that does is when you've had redlining, all these wealthy communities, they're going to get really good financial support going into their schools, and you're going to have less going into those impoverished areas. That's a structural problem. We need people who want to do anti-racist work to challenge that. We've got to change our curricula in this country and make some changes around teaching and learning. So, I've given you sort of 5 things we get wrong about racism, and then here's what we kind of need to do in regards to some next steps. So now I want to open it up to some questions.
Well, Dr. Brogdon, thanks. That was great. I've received a few questions, and I'll just sort of filter through them. Here's one. One of our participants tonight, I think, maybe trying to hold on to hope, says, I can't agree with Derek Bell's idea that racism will never go away. And this person wants to know, why do you agree with that thought?
Well, what from the history of this country would lead anyone to believe that racism will go away? So my response is, it's baked into the cake. The Christians have been in this country the entire time. They've been going to church, they've been reading the Bible, they've been praying, they've been singing all these songs, and they don't do anything to the system. And the reason I believe it's permanent is because, again, you're gonna have to get masses of people who have been advantaged to give up all of that advantage so that there's an equal system. Do you know how heavy an ask that is? I'm talking about, so you're talking about 70-something% of the population of this country are white Americans who have had this 400-year advantage. They now all of a sudden they're gonna have to give up a lot so that there's real equity. And I would be more inclined to believe people who aren't Christians will probably be a little more willing to do that. But when people of faith, they're gonna explain it away, that God blessed them with this, and we need to just kind of let those things go instead of giving up your privilege and building completely different economic, social, and educational structures. So we're gonna fight, but I don't believe you can get millions and millions of white people to give up all those advantages.
Oh. Fair enough. A couple of our participants tonight were unfamiliar with the language of black codes. Do you want to say a word about that, or do you want to reference a book that you think is particularly good about addressing that topic?
Well, I think an easy thing would be is probably Google it, and also go to YouTube and watch some short videos. So there was a thing called the slave codes, which were a lot of laws around how enslaved persons supposed to function. So what ended up happening is that after slavery was deemed unconstitutional and illegal, the folks in the South were worried that they were going to lose control of the masses of blacks. So they just basically, to use a hip hop expression, they remixed the slave codes, turned them into black codes, which are just ridiculous laws. Okay, like there was an African American arrested in Florida for disobeying a command of his master. Now, slavery is illegal. Why are you arresting me for not obeying a law? Because it's a law. All right, it's a completely unjust law. They would arrest African Americans for things like vagrancy, There's no economy to support them. Oh, you don't have a job. We're going to arrest you. You can't ride the train unless you can pay for a ticket. Well, they don't have a job. Well, we're going to arrest you. And what the Black Codes did was it was a loophole in the 13th Amendment that says you can't be enslaved unless you're convicted of a crime. So then once you started to criminalize these people, then they were able to re-enslave them. So the Black Codes ended up supporting the practice we call convict leasing, which was then once they were arrested, well, they said, well, you know, now that you're in prison, you gotta work for this business. You gotta work for the state government was involved in it. In other words, they were basically re-enslaved. So they were using stupid laws to re-enslave blacks so that they could continue to work for free so that whites could benefit. So Black Codes, convict leasing, and this stuff went on well into the World War II era. All right, so convict leasing did. Black Codes kind of faded in the late 1800s, but of course, what did the Black Codes give rise to? Jim Crow.
Dr. Brogdon, would you spoke of reparations. What do you consider to be a possible first step in a longer process?
Endowing HBCUs. So there were 107 HBCUs 5 years ago. 6 have closed. So they're just not funded. They don't have, I mean, you know, we didn't get the benefit from the slave trade in enslaving people like Harvard and Princeton and Brown and Dartmouth and University of Pennsylvania and UNC Chapel Hill and the University of Georgia. And I have the full list of all the schools that trace their roots back to this era. And it's basically the whole foundation of our system of higher education. Blacks couldn't go to these white schools, so blacks started their own schools. But they were always underfunded, and they didn't have the benefit of a wealthy person like the Browns, who owned slaves and leveraged how many slaves he owned to buy insurance bonds to get rich, to then make huge donations to a university that they decide to name after him. And everybody wants to go to Brown University. But Kamala Harris, where did she get her undergraduate? At Howard University, an HBCU. We only have 101 left. Simmons is the last one. The last problem these institutions should have should be just money for operations, given our history. So to me, a first step would be endowing HBCUs and then doing something with the African Americans who have been in these predominantly white institutions and just have all this student loan debt. The possibility of them ever being a homeowner is, you know, we have to do something. So to me, those are two things that I've heard floated that I really like.
Dr. Brogdon, is there a particular piece of legislation that you have your eye on right now that you think is particularly important that white people are aware of and act on?
I would say HR 40 is the bill that goes before Congress every year, and HR 40 is a bill to just commission the study of reparations. So to me, it would be good to have more white Americans writing members of Congress and encouraging them, because HR 40 is not calling for reparations. It's saying we need to study this so that we can explore what we need to do. So it will take more goodwill from whites to kind of push members of Congress to really take a look at this. And then I will also encourage every person, every time they pass the budget, to download that PDF. It's hundreds of pages, but I have Trump's budget, okay? And so you can see where the money goes. So to me, we can do something with reparations. If you see what we spend on spending and how much gets wasted on spending, I mean, we have more bombs than anybody. We can still keep all the bombs we have, make less bombs, and do some things to really kind of build up our country. And I tell you, if I was running for office, which I never would, we also need to spend less on defense because our infrastructure is crumbling in this country. Oh, but we do have great bombs. That was sarcasm. Yeah.
Right. Dr. Brogdon, I think one of the things that many of the folks on our call tonight are speaking to is some kind of portal into engagement, helpful engagement with the Black community. They're wondering if they're, like we've had some speakers on this series, Bread for the World, for example, which happens to be a Christian hunger group, a lobby group that invites people to participate in how do we address the problem of hunger domestically and internationally. And it gives them all kinds of like first step, second step, third step. Is such a thing available currently? Is there a Black-led organization that is seeking out white people to join them as colleagues and as partners to address the issue of racism directly? And is something you can recommend? Well,
locally in the city of Louisville, we have a group that's called Empower West. And what the Empower West model is, it's white leaders who are willing to come into Black space and follow Black leadership to address issues of the Black community. So they don't come in there and kind of take over, well, I know what we should do. They come in to listen and then to say, how can we help? And the focus is on really them kind of getting educated about Black issues, then trying to support Black businesses. So if you're in the Louisville area, Empower West it's a wonderful group. They do a lot of education and advocacy work, including there's a letter that they've sent out to Mayor Fisher about making a call for reparations. So the Empower West, I think, is a good group. If you're not in Louisville, then I want to encourage you to find an HBCU that's possibly in your area, or it might be a predominantly white school and that might have a Black student union or a Black student group. Find some ways to kind of plug in and to continue to educate yourself and to find ways that you can support. So I would, based on those three issues I focused on, whether it's criminal justice, education, or economic reform, maybe find one that fits your gifts and your skills. And I would encourage, everyone to start studying the laws that they're voting on locally at the state level, as well as in DC, and then letting folks know laws that are being passed, because sometimes as African Americans, we're in survival mode. So I'm always trying to make sure I'm paying attention, because once something is passed as a law, and this is why Mayor Fisher is hiding behind this policy and won't let these officers that murdered Breonna Taylor be brought to justice, because, there's a policy that's going to protect them. Well, we have to change those policies. That's doing anti-racist work.
Great. Well, I'm aware that we're near the end here, and I would like to invite all of those who are on the call who can't say a word, show Dr. Brogdon your appreciation just with a visible hand clap. Dr. Brogdon, thank you very, very much.
And if I can say to each and every one of you, just the gratitude that I feel that you would take time out of your evening to open up your heart and your mind and to listen and to learn and to lock arms in this struggle. These systems, they are real. Their effect upon people's lives, these things they are real and they are incredibly painful. But it is heartening to see folks who are willing to listen and to say, whatever I can do, I'm willing to do that. And so I just want to thank you. You've encouraged me tonight to keep writing and to keep, sharing these things with the world. So thank you all, and Just Faith, I love y'all. Thank y'all.
Thank you, Dr. Brogdon. I'd like to close tonight with a little piece of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. And it's got a significant meaning, I think, for those of us who maybe are tempted to have our eyes averted to the next thing in the news. He said, "We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. May it be so. Everybody, thanks again for joining us. Stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you again next month. Thank you.
Take care, you all.